Okay, I think I will wait for 1 minute to see if more participants are going to join. Okay, so hello and welcome everyone to this session between conversion and automobile consensus. My name is Nora Krenmayr and I'm going to moderate this session. First, we will hear a 30 minutes presentation on the topic by Melanie Pichler and Markus Wissen. During and after the presentation, you are invited to write questions in the chat. Please mark them with the questions button. If you prefer to write in German, please do so. I'm going to collect the questions and pass them on to Melanie and Markus, and so I can translate the questions. Please be patient and understanding if your question is not taken up. I will do my best not to miss any question and be fair. However, if I perceive a gender imbalance, I'm going to prefer questions by persons whose gender I presume is female. Well, now, before I hand over to Melanie and Markus, I will briefly introduce them. Melanie Pichler works and teaches at the Institute of Social-Ecology in Vienna. And Markus Wissen is professor of social sciences at the Berlin School of Economics and Law. Both have been working on the Con-Labor project for the past 2 years. The project is funded by the Austrian Climate and Energy Fund, and it analyzes the possibilities and obstacles for a social-ecological conversion of the Austrian automobile industry, with a focus on the role of employees and their representatives in this process. So please, Melanie.
Thank you very much, Nora. I hope everyone can hear me. It's quite strange to speak into a laptop and not seeing and hearing any one of you. But nevertheless, we gonna present some results of a transdisciplinary research project we did, or we are still actually doing. We are finishing the project right now on the role of work and workers in the transformation of the Austrian automotive industry. As Nora said, I'm going to present the results together with Markus Wissen. And apart from Nora, Markus, and myself, in the project team, there are also Ulrich Brandt, Daniel Mannecker, and Heinz Högelsberger. So some of you may have also seen already at the Degrowth conference, as they also have other roles there. So how is the presentation structured? First, I'm going to present you some information on why we actually choose to study the automotive industry, so information on the transport sector, CO2 emissions, and general mobility transformations. Then some information on why we focus on workers and work for a social-ecological transformation. And the results section is basically split into two broad streams. One is some information on the structure of the Austrian automotive industry, as this hopefully shows you some of the reasons why a transformation of the automotive industry is actually so difficult. And then along a section on how do actually workers in the automotive industry perceive the situation and the future transformation of their industries. Okay, so then first of all, some information on the transport sector. As you may know, the transport sector is the single most important contributor to the climate crisis. So in the EU, 27% of CO2 emissions can be attributed to the transport sector. So, and especially road transport, shipping, and aviation have yearly increased in the last decades. The majority of transport-related emissions can be attributed to passenger cars and the automotive industry, and that's actually why the transformation of this sector is so important for a social-ecological transformation and also for a degrowth society. On the right-hand side on the graph, you can see that 72% of all the transport-related emissions can be attributed to road transport. And within the sector of road transport, more than 60% can be attributed to passenger cars and the automotive industry. Okay, then some information maybe on the transformations in the mobility sector, in the transport sector, and also because I think this is important with regard to the project, because we kind of have two different notions of transformation. So on the one hand, there is obviously a vision of transformation that is target-oriented. So we know where we would like to go in with regard to mobility transformation. So what needs to be transformed, and this is what I'm going to present you on this slide in a minute. But on the other hand, apart from this more target or goal-oriented idea of transformation, we have a more analytical understanding of transformation when we talk with the workers, where we want to see not how do we tell them what we need, but how can we better understand what their idea and vision of transformation is, so that we can then try to align these different notions of transformation. So how can we try to better integrate more goal-oriented or normative idea of how a transformation in the mobility sector should look like, and how this is connected to what actually happens in the mobility sector or in the automotive industry, and why this happens. So with regard to mobility transformations, we can see that there are basically three strands of how to transform the mobility sector. So the first and most important one is definitely reducing road transport. So if we want to reduce and drastically reduce CO2 emissions in the transport sector, we have to reduce road transport. So this might be through shorter distances between places of work and places of living. This might be through more basic infrastructure in communities, so that people are not forced to commute long distances. This might also be through more regional economies, so that, for example, transport distances are reduced. The second strand, apart from reducing road transport, is replacing. So road transport that can't be reduced anymore may be replaced. So from passenger cars, from road transport to other forms of other means of transportation that are more climate friendly. And that is, for example, public transport, that might be trains, that might also be cycling and walking. You can see in the graph on the bottom, on the right-hand side, the most climate detrimental means of transformation, and on the left-hand side, the most climate-friendly means of transportation. And I'm sorry that the graph is in German, but on the right-hand side, you see that's transportation by plane, which is most climate detrimental. Then you have combustion engine passenger cars, then you have electric cars, then you have electric buses, and then train. And cycling and walking, as we know, is obviously emission-free. And only those forms of transport that can't be reduced or replaced, there is room for improving road transport, which might mean lighter and more economical cars, more climate-friendly driving engines like electric or hydrogen cars, or also more people per car. For example, at the moment, on average, there are only 1.2 people in one car. So, and the most important thing, obviously, is that most strategies at the moment with regard to mobility transformations can be seen in improving road transport. So switching from combustion engine to electric cars, for example, which is obviously important, but if we don't focus beforehand on reducing and replacing road transport, we won't reach the emission target reductions we have to reach to prevent the most detrimental implications of the climate crisis. Okay, so while we actually know that there have to be drastic reductions in CO2 emissions in the mobility system, at the same time, there are thousands of jobs that are directly or indirectly linked to the production of vehicles. So in the literature, this is called the jobs versus environment dilemma. So as a high percentage of and a large number of people relies on this industrial production for their livelihoods, this obviously also creates the transformation creates resistance. So in the EU, for example, more than 6% of the total workforce, that's 13.8 million people, directly or indirectly work for the automotive industry. In Austria, it's almost 80,000 people that are employed in the wider automotive sector. So the challenge for mobility transformations is that they have to be both sustainable, so they have to radically reduce CO2 emissions, and also just. So they have to provide alternative opportunities for workers in order to increase legitimacy for these transformations. So based on these problem descriptions, we asked in the project what the actual potentials and barriers for a sustainability transformation in the Austrian automotive industry from a worker's perspective are, how the workers perceive the current situation and the future of the automotive industry, and how the knowledge of workers may be mobilized for a social-ecological conversion. And maybe on here I would like to say one or two sentences on specific terms and definitions. So we use the terms transformation as well as conversion in the project and also in this presentation. We speak about transformation when we talk about change in the overall mobility system, about when we talk about societal change, but we speak about conversion when we talk about the specific production level. So when we talk about transformations in the industrial production of cars, of passenger cars and other kinds of vehicles. So when we talk about the company or the sector level of industrial transformation. Good. And then how did we do? How did we approach these resource questions? We did, in the beginning, we did some kind of literature and document analysis, and the most important methods in the project were expert interviews with the Workers' Council members, with trade union representatives, with the Chamber of Labor, some management interviews and ministries. So in total, we did 27 interviews between November 2018 and November 2019. So first, we did some initial and more exploratory interviews with the Transport Ministry, with the two most important trade unions, which is the ProG and the GPA, with the Chamber of Labor, and also with the management of the two automotive clusters. So in Austria, the automotive industry is structured in 3 clusters: in Styria, in Vienna, and in Upper Austria. And we did one interview in Styria and one in Upper Austria. Also because in Vienna there is no spokesperson for the cluster. And then most of the interviews, about 20 interviews, were with workers' councils, so Betriebsräte in German, in the most important automotive supply companies in Austria. And then towards the end of the project, so in November in 2019 and January 2020, we did 2 focus groups where we invited some of the interviewers with whom we already spoke. So about 5 people each focus group, and presented some initial results and let them discuss their perspectives on these results. Okay, and now before I hand over to Markus, 2 slides on the general structure of the automotive industry, which might hopefully help to give you a better feeling of what this industry is and why it's difficult or easy, maybe more difficult to transform it. So first, as you've seen already with regard to the numbers that are employed in the industry, it's quite significant economically. So 8% of the industrial production in Austria. The Austrian automotive industry is mainly a supplier industry for international corporations, which also means, and this is important with regard to the transformation potential, there is quite little decision-making power on what to produce, what products to produce in Austria. So 65% of the workers are employed in companies with headquarters elsewhere. So just to give you 2 examples, there's one branch of BMW in Steyr in Upper Austria, BMW obviously being a German company. There is a branch of Opel PSA in Vienna, where the headquarters is in France. So these are just some examples, but there are more companies like this. Connected to this, there is a high dependence on exports, especially to the German automotive industry. So almost 90% of all the products produced in Austria are exported, more than half of them to Germany. And which is also quite a big problem for the transformation of the industry, there is a strong focus on the combustion engine. So 1/4 of the production was focused on engine and gear units in 2018. And to give you also some graphical information on the structure, what you can see on this graph is a map of Austria. I hope you can see this. And some of the most important companies. So depending on the number of employers in the company, the circles are bigger or smaller. And then what you can see is that the blue circles are companies that produce mainly for the automotive industry, whereas the yellow ones are companies that also produce for other industries. So yellow would be, it is easier for them to transform because they also have other industries to supply, which might be, for example, that this is a company that produces textiles, and some of the textiles go to the automotive industry, but the majority of the products go to other sectors. And then the empty circles mean that these companies rely mainly on the combustion engine, whereas the full circles mean that so full circle blue, for example, the biggest circle in Styria that you can see is, I mean, that's no surprise, that's Magna. So Magna is obviously, it's blue because it's an automotive company. It produces cars. It's difficult to produce anything else. but at the same time, it's a full circle because it's not. It does not rely on the combustion engine. It can also produce electric cars or whatever. That's not important for the company. So what you can see is that there is actually, although the industry is a supplier industry, they rely heavily on producing vehicles, on producing passenger cars, not necessarily in Austria, but elsewhere in Europe. And a lot of them actually, especially in Upper Austria, heavily rely on the combustion engine, which also has to do with the fact that, for example, BMW that is located in Upper Austria has a special competence center on improving the combustion engine, which explains a lot of the inertia of the companies in this region. Okay, and with this, I hand over to Markus.
Yeah, thanks a lot to Melanie, and welcome also from my side. I'm going on with the question how do workers perceive the situation of the automotive industry in Austria, and which assumptions do they have concerning the future of this industry? So which transformation or conversion pathways do they imagine or consider probable in the next years? So basically we found out that there are three perceptions of the workers, the work council members that we interviewed. The first two are closely connected to what Melanie has presented as improving automobility, technically improving it. And the first one relies to the combustion engine. This was the one that was strongest represented in the workers that we interviewed. There's a high trust in the improvement of the combustion engine. So many workers representatives think that the combustion engine will have a future and that their specific role will be in contributing to improving this, to technically improving it, to making it more efficient. I'm absolutely convinced. That's a quotation from one interview with a work council member. I'm absolutely convinced that we will continue producing combustion engines even on a large scale in the next years, in the next decade even. A second perception is a diversification of the automotive, of the car manufacturing. A diversification mostly into the direction of more electro-automobility. Our areas of work will be the combustion engine, the electric battery, and the fuel cell, said one work council member in the interview. So these are the two dominant perceptions, the improvement of the combustion engine first, and second, the diversification, mainly into the direction of more electro-automobility. For the third path, which concerns more with what Melanie has introduced as replacing and reducing, there was very little evidence. So only a few people whom we interviewed considered a mobility transformation and transformation of the dominant pattern of automobility as probable. One interviewee said, it is a question of behavior. The claim for individual mobility will not decrease. Not everybody likes going by train where it smells because there's a crowd of people sitting inside. So there's a kind of naturalization of individual mobility via the car. This seems to be the normal way to move around. It's a kind of naturalization or normalization of this, which prevents the workers and the work council members to imagine alternative futures in form of a transformation of the mobility patterns. If a transformation is envisioned, the following drivers are mentioned. The state is considered responsible. I believe that politics have to decide. Consumption will follow, one work council member said. Or it is society where certain patterns are changing. I think, this is a quotation from a trade union member, I think that there is a potential for a mobility change in the population. Compared to the past, much has happened. And this, of course, has to do with Greta, but it is also due to climate change and the recent flood in Kärnten. So there are social changes going on due to Fridays for Future and the rising new climate movement. And there are also crisis situations like floods, like heavy rain, like storms, who are due to climate change that make people think differently about mobility. So it's society, it's societal changes that take place. Furthermore, employees see themselves as actors of mobility transformation in their role as members of society. I am a special biker, one work council member said to us, and there are many eccentric guys in our company. They went by bike as students and now they ride a bike in the business suite. This transformation works. So what we hardly did find out, that workers consider themselves as agents of a transformation in their role of workers, in their role of people who possess certain competences, who dispose over the means of production to a certain way, and who by their very qualification could contribute to overcoming the car-centered mobility system. There was rarely evidence for this. What is the reason for this? Why are workers so hesitant to see a certain role for themselves in overcoming a car-centered mobility system? So first of all, as Melanie has already shown in her graphs, there's a high dependence, a high degree of dependence on the combustion engine. So many of the workers, or the work council members whom we interviewed, work in factories and firms that produce components for combustion engines. The role of production technology also is important. One work council member told us, our machines are particularly designed for our product. You cannot simply convert them. So there's a certain technological path dependency that prevents workers and firms as a whole to produce alternatives beyond the car-centered mobility system. Although I would say that this has changed a little bit, because the Corona experience shows us that there is a possibility for car manufacturers to produce different things. In Germany, for example, some car manufacturers or supplier companies produce respirators for hospitals, where they can use to treat COVID-19 patients. So I'm not so sure if this path dependency of the production technology would be emphasized this way if we interviewed the person today. And third, we have to consider the position in the corporation and the value chain. Melanie also already told us that there's a strong dependence of the Austrian automotive industry on exports and on companies which are external to Austria, the mother companies of the suppliers, or the companies on whose work they depend are outside of Austria. So there's little room for strategic decision making. There is sometimes also not so much research and development done in the Austrian supplier industry. If there are some very innovative firms, which we also found out. If there is research and development done in the supply industry, of course, people see more possibilities for a future role of their firm and of their own work in transforming the mobility system. There is a strong intra-firm competition, a competition between individual parts of a firm in different countries, which exerts an enormous pressure on the workers, a pressure that they have to comply with somehow in order to really maintain the location, to save the firm, to safeguard their jobs. One assumption or one conclusion we draw from our interviews is that workers, since, let's say, or for 20 years, for more or less 2 decades, have experienced a very strong pressure of a permanent reorganization regarding the ownership of the company or regarding the production technology, the organization of the labor process. And of course, in such a situation, a new change towards completely different mobility patterns may be considered as an additional threat. There is a certain desire for stability. And if people trust in the future of the combustion engine, this will also be an expression of this desire for stability that is due to this permanent reorganization process that puts enormous pressure on workers in recent times. Nevertheless, what we also found out that there is a high trust of workers in their own knowledge and competencies. So just to give you some examples from work council representatives and from the interviews they gave us. If you work in the automotive industry, you can, of course, supply any other area because the automotive industry is one with the highest requirements. Another quotation from work council members of an arms manufacturer. We have often suggested and projected the construction of fire engines. Just look at Greece, Portugal, and other regions where fires are common. Here, the normal fire brigade soon reaches its limits. That's why we said, okay, let's take a track vehicle and redesign it. Like on the airport, we put a water gun on top and water tanks inside. This was an initiative by workers. They thought about what could they do, what could they produce that is socially useful, that helps other people. And they indeed tried to do that. They developed ideas, they developed concepts, but they were stopped by the management that said, no, we are an arms company. We are not going to produce these socially useful things because we keep to our normal production. A third interview quotation. These people, and the work council member means his fellow workers, these people are indeed great. There is a kind of collective intelligence. They always make the best of it. As we say, they make butter of shit. It's absolutely pretentious, but my colleagues from the work council and I often say that we are those who actually manage the company. Quite interesting. It's a very strong trust into their own competences. So there's a certain discrepancy. On the one hand, workers imagine the future of automobility as more or less an improvement of what is happening today. Electromobility, fuel cells being that what can be achieved, but no fundamental transformation of the mobility patterns. On the other hand, they have a strong trust in their own competence, in their own knowledge that would enable them to principally produce things for different purposes and also for a socially useful and an environmentally friendly mobility system. How could this knowledge of workers be mobilized for a socio-ecological conversion? How could we bring these two parts together, about which Melanie talked at the beginning of her presentation, of her part? So in order to reason about this, we took a distinction that was drawn by Michael Boeravoy as early as 1979, when he wrote about the ways of manufacturing consent in capitalist firms. Boeravoy distinguished between economic, political, and ideological struggles. economic struggles are bargaining processes. Bargaining about the norms of output, about what can be expected from workers in a certain working time. They do not question the rules of the game, but within these bargaining processes, they rather produce and affirm the rules of the game. The second type of struggle is the political struggle. This is about the rules of the game, about shaping the labor process. As Burabai puts it, workers actively struggle against management to defend the conditions for producing profit. We also found some evidence for this in our interviews and focus groups. So one work council member, for example, said, "It seems to be pretentious, but it is indeed like this. Often we have been able to prevent the complete madness. So we struggled against that, what the managers wanted to do with us and with the production processes. We knew that that was nonsense. This was a kind of, let's say, a new fashion taken from a business administration handbook, that they tried to implement in our factory. And we knew if they succeeded, there would be the complete chaos. Nothing will work anymore. And so we resisted, and we were able to resist and to prevent the complete chaos from happening. This is an interesting finding for which we found at least a little bit evidence. So the third type of struggles is ideological struggle. It is about the how and the what of production. And to quote again from Burabai, if the self-organization of workers is necessary for the survival of capitalism, see the political struggles, it also questions the foundations of capitalism. So if the self-organization and the resistance of workers against the management is necessary for the survival of capitalism, for the functioning of the firm, it can also question the foundations of capitalism, because we see here that workers are the ones who indeed contribute a lot to the functioning of the firm, who organize the labor process, who steer the labor process. So this is a question of power relations of domination. We did not find so much, or let's say we did not find evidence for a spillover of political struggles into ideological struggles, where indeed the very foundations of the capitalist production process is questioned. But nevertheless, we ask ourselves, how could this possibly be achieved? What would be the preconditions for the political struggle to spill over into an ideological struggle? And here we go a little bit away from our immediate research findings and relate our research findings to other research and political work that has done on the subject. So our argument would be, basically there are two differences or two contradictions two tangents that one could observe. Melanie has mentioned the contradiction between jobs and the environment, the jobs versus environment dilemma. Indeed, this is very important. The dilemma or the contradiction, the conflicts between individual job security on the one hand and the collective ecological rationality on the other hand. But of course, there's a further contradiction, because workers are not just employees, workers are also members of society. They are mothers, fathers of kids, for example, who on Friday go out to the streets in order to demonstrate for a better future. And I think it's quite important, and here we also draw on the findings by Nora and David Assel, to take very seriously this second contradiction and to combine it with the first one. So the idea here would be, if we consider workers in a very comprehensive way, not only as employees, but also as members of the society, who as members of the society have an interest in a clean environment, in possibly also overcoming environmentally destructive mobility patterns, then we find other entry points for a more fundamental social-ecological transformation of mobility patterns. we can connect shop floor and everyday life experiences and address both types of conflicts and contradictions. In order to achieve this, we think that the state and society have to play a major role here. The state in the form, for example, of a social-ecological industrial policy that currently is happening in times of Corona. So the state has changed its role completely. What was seen as nearly impossible or completely against the economic mainstream before is happening worldwide right now. The state has assumed a very much stronger role in the economy. It steers the economy. Yeah? It steers the economy, and indeed, without the role of the state and of society in the economy, the Corona crisis would be much more severe than it actually is. So this would be one important point, but also trade unions, for example, are required, are challenged. They are challenged to not only see workers as employees, but to, and here a quote from Nora and David Ussel, to reinvent themselves as representatives of workers, also as members of society. Kim Moody has called this the social movement unionism. So social movement, so unions turn into social movements responsible also for the everyday life conditions of the workers. This would be very important. And if you look at the history of conversion initiatives, out of which more comprehensive transformation could result, if you look at the history, we always see that both contradictions, or both areas, are very important, the shop floor and the society. And often it is society where certain incentives, where certain political ideas arise that are discussed on the shop floor and are tried to work with on the shop floor. The automotive industry itself is very important in this respect. In the early 1980s, for example, there were conversion initiatives in the automotive industry. And they were inspired by the ecological movement of that time. A participant, a former activist and automotive worker to that time said that, yeah, we were influenced by these social movements. We discussed their politics, we discussed their requirements, their demands in our coffee break on the shop floor. Yeah? And we thought about how could we contribute to foster these objectives? How could we, with our knowledge, with our possibility, with our capacity to control complex production processes, contribute to foster these objectives by, for example, producing something that is more environmentally sensitive than cars. Yeah? So to combine these two aspects seems to be a very important way to mobilizing the knowledge of workers for a social-ecological conversion and a transformation of mobility patterns. Economic democracy would be quite useful and, I would say, a necessary condition for this, because often these initiatives have failed because of capitalist property relations that give workers no possibility to co-determine what is happening in the production process, to equally participate in the decision-making process, regarding strategic decisions of the firms. And this has to be changed. If we think about the economic democracy, then we think about forms of representation of workers that enables them indeed to determine what happens in a firm, what is the strategy of the firm, which products have to be built under which conditions. And this would be the second and last point, which would be quite important to understand how we could come into a situation where the knowledge of workers can be mobilized for socio-ecological conversion and transformation process. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Yes, thank you, Melanie and Markus, for this very insightful presentation. During the presentation, there already popped up several very interesting questions. And I think I'm going to take up the last one first, because it's a very good entry question. Dennis writes, many of your findings reflect what industrial sociologists have been describing as going on among especially higher skilled workers for a long time. did you find anything that goes beyond the known? Anything really surprising in your material? As Markus has been speaking for the last 15 minutes, Melanie, maybe you want to answer first?
Yes. Do you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Dennis. That's obviously really a very good question, but also a difficult one, I think. I was thinking about it a little bit while Markus was speaking, and for me, one of the interesting things was that, I mean, you can't really generalize this, but I had the feelings that sometimes workers or workers' councils at the shop floor level sometimes had more ideas or more visions on how to transform than union members, for example. So on especially, some trade union members would be very defensive with regard to protecting the workforce from more radical transformations in the sector, whereas I had the feeling that some of the workers were quite aware that there have to be changes, but at the same time they miss kind of a counterpart to with whom to discuss these aspects. And another thing that I don't know if this is something new, but for me it was interesting because actually most of the workers have a clear idea of the climate crisis, and nobody would say, well, that's not important. Not at all. So some of them have a really clear ecological consciousness. So they would see also their role as, I don't know, for example, as a consumer or as a person that is politically interested. But at the same time, there was hardly any workers that relate this environmental consciousness to the production, to what they produce, or to them as a worker. But they would say, for example, okay, there are a lot of initiatives on how workers can commute to the company by bike and not by car, which is already quite interesting for people producing cars, that they are not really, because we expected them to be much more proud of what they produce and the car and also the brand of the car being so important for them. But actually that was not the case. So they said, well, we have some initiatives where we try to not use the car for going to work, but at the same time, the what to produce is something completely different, because it's so out of sight that they could decide on this in a way, because there is so much competition anyway. Yeah. Maybe this to begin with. Markus, you want to add?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, of course, there are some many of the findings. We confirm some of the findings of past research, but nevertheless, we see an increasing contradiction at the moment. Yeah, the environmental question has been politicized in a way that has not happened before, and this is a new situation. This is a new situation also for the workers here, and I think. Whereas in past research, the environmental question was not that important, mainly maybe in the 1980s when the environmental movement was stronger. Today, it cannot be neglected anymore. And this, of course, enhances the contradiction within work in which workers have to move at the moment. Yeah? How they deal with the contradictions, how they try to overcome them, or how they understand their own role with regard to an increasing ecological crisis. That was what we discussed, or what we asked them, and we tried to find out in the interviews. And I think this discrepancy, of which Melanie talked just now, was one of the findings that for us was quite interesting, and also questioning how can we understand the preconditions for the workers and for the production processes to overcome these discrepancies. That was quite a new thing for us, and I think this is something which we could even proceed further or try to investigate further in future research. So we had a limited amount of time, a limited amount of resources. So our research, I would say, is still to a large part explorative. We could go deeper. We could have gone deeper into much of these issues. We could have done, or this would be a next step for the research. We should go on with a more representative, quantitative analysis and survey of the workers' visions, of the workers' perceptions of the current situation, in order to find out a little bit more about how they deal with the contradictions and what are the conditions to mobilize the ecological knowledge also in the production process. This would be a further process. This would be a further process that would be necessary, and I think that would be very valuable to analyze. We had not the time and the means to do that because we had a 2 years research project with a limited amount of resources and time, so that we could not go much deeper here. But I think to sum up, this new condition of an increasing ecological crisis that has an influence on the everyday consciousness of workers and the perceptions of the social development by workers on the one hand, and their own role in the production process. This is what indeed is a finding that might go beyond the existing state of the art of research, because it shows the pressing character of the ecological crisis, because it stands for a completely different situation that has changed by the politicization of climate change and the ecological crisis by the new climate movement.
Thank you both for the answers. More questions are coming in, but I will go back to the first question from Patrick, also because it plays into what Markus just said. Patrick asks, did you consider to talk directly with the workers rather than with their union representatives? And Markus, you just said it was a project for 2 years with limited resources, but maybe you want to say a few sentences how the decision was made.
Yeah, it was also a pragmatic decision. It would not have been possible to do so. Yeah. I think if we talk, we are completely aware that if we just talk with work council members, we do not get the immediate expression and view of workers, but only a mediated through the view and through the work of the work council members. But I think that was, on the one hand, it was a pragmatic decision because of our resources. Yeah, it was not possible to talk with workers. But on the other hand, of course, if we had talked with workers, we also would have to take the decision with which workers we talk. Yeah, we would have to select let's say a representative sample of workers. Yeah, I think one can do this via a quantitative survey, but it is difficult to do it via qualitative interviews. Our idea was we talk with the work council members, and with that we get not a representative picture of what is happening on the shop floor, but nevertheless we get an insight into what is happening and what is discussed here. And indeed, we did so because the shop floor, the work council members are very well informed what is happening on their shop floor. We talked with one work council member who informed us about the conflicts that are going on his shop floor. He talked about the strengthening right movement among the workers, the strengthening right racism and so on. We got via this work council member, we got a good insight into the conflicts, into the divisions, into the perceptions, into the thoughts of workers too. But in order to indeed research them in a more representative way, there would have been the need to do a quantitative and representative survey of workers, for which we didn't have the resources and the time. So that's why we decided to do the interviews, the expert interviews with the working council members. And I think indeed we got some good information and some good insights also into the way the workers perceive the current developments.
Thank you. Melanie, do you want to add something, or are you ready for our next question? Because then I will give the question from Nina to you. She writes, by focusing on Austria and its employees of the automotive industry, you might lose sight of the workers as well as affected local communities in the global south, where the metals for more climate-friendly cars originate from. Do you take this link into consideration? If so, how?
Yeah, again, I think this is a really interesting question, and at the same time, the answer is quite short. I mean, it's very important to take this link into account, but it was just not possible to do so with the resources we had. So, because, I mean, on the one hand, it's not only about raw materials for climate-friendly mobility, no, but it's raw materials for all kinds of production, which we didn't take into account. As Markus said, it was a 2-year project, and we focused on the Austrian automotive industry. I mean, I think it's right. We could have without qualitative interviews in countries in the global south, which was obviously not possible. We could have thought a little bit more about not only where the products go to, like they mainly go to Germany, other parts of Europe, but also where the raw materials come from. I mean, we haven't done this, and I think it would be interesting for a follow-up project, because it's obviously very important, but we haven't systematically researched it.
Mm-hmm. Can I add one point to this? So I think, of course, it was implicitly a very important point in our project. So when we distinguish between reducing and replacing and improving, then of course we have in mind the resource constraints and the way that the resource use in countries like Austria or Germany impacts the living conditions of people in the global south, in those regions where the resources come from. Of course we have this in mind. Yeah. And therefore, it was a very important point implicitly. Our normative orientation is towards a fundamental transformation of mobility patterns, and that we have this normative idea, of course, has to do with the fact that car production and use in the northern countries impacts the living conditions of people in the global south. So it is a very important implicit starting assumption of our whole project.
Yes, thank you. Questions from Manuela and Gerhard kind of go into the direction of a mobility transformation. They both wrote into the chat before Markus talked about fire vehicles, like the idea to produce fire vehicles, but I will post them anyway. I will read Manuela's question. Did the workers, trade unions, representatives think about other products or goods that not electric cars, but other products, for example, public transport? Markus, I think I will first give it to you, and then Melanie, you can add.
Yeah, it was a bit difficult. Some of them, of course, thought about this, but let's say it depended on the degree of dependence on the car manufacturing. So in those firms who were indeed strongly dependent on car manufacturing, there were only a few thoughts, or there was little evidence on thinking about other forms of transport. Of course, we asked, but there was no much response to this. But in other firms, which have a high research and development intensity, and which are so-called hidden champions, so indeed very innovative companies that are leading on their specific sector, and they have leading technologies and leading products even on a world scale. Of course, people thought, we could think about redirecting this. Sometimes we also learned that some of the firms used to produce equipment for public transport before the owners of the firms obliged them to specialize them for components for cars. But nevertheless, the knowledge is still there, and therefore also the imagination, the idea that this could possibly be reversed, and that production for other sectors could restart it again. But indeed, it depended indeed on the degree of dependence and orientation towards the automotive sector and towards the combustion engine.
Thank you. We're getting very long and interesting questions. But first, I will take up Ernest, who already wrote like a couple of minutes ago, and it goes to you, Melanie. Should we not consider the needed transformation of industries as an opportunity and drastically reduce work in society in a just manner? For instance, by strengthening social provisioning, introducing a right not to work, and drastically reduce per capita working time?
Yes, of course we should. But I think with regard to the project, the focus was on like how would workers perceive this transformation, and if working time reduction is something that they would suggest. And I would say from the interviews, it didn't really come up as a suggestion, or only after we asked it specifically. And I think this is important because I think it also has to do with the occasions when working time reductions were put in place were crises, like crisis-driven events, like Kurzarbeit. Now also, it's not something that people would see as something progressive in a way, because it always had to do with crises. And I think that's something that is an important finding from the project, and that we have to consider. Then, of course, this is only speculation. Then why working time reduction is not a vision that is brought up by workers. One could say that, well, because unions in Austria haven't really strategically and also practically fought for it in the last decades and whatever. So that might be reasons for this, but like in the interviews, working time reduction did not really come up as something important, although definitely I believe that this is the way to go. And maybe I also to reflect a little bit on what was said before. So what are actually the conditions for specific proposals to materialize? Like, for example, what are the conditions that workers think that it's actually possible to produce something else? So to produce products for public transport? Or what are the conditions that people think it's actually possible to think working time reduction might be something progressive that we would like to achieve? And I think this is interesting because what came up a lot in our interviews is that, well, for certain aspects, the state has to decide, or this is a political decision. So if there is a political or society or a state decision on specific aspects, then of course this changes the setting, and this changes the whole grounds on which to think about the future. But at the moment, this ground is competition and very specialized production for, I don't know, small parts for the automotive industry. And in this setting, it's very difficult to think about something completely new. Yeah.
May I add one thought here? I think we have to consider the situation where we conducted the interviews. Yeah, it was in 2019. Yeah, and this was a situation where the economic position of the interviewees and the firms where they work in was quite good. Yeah. The order situation was very good. Yeah, and people tended to underestimate the crisis of the automotive industry. I think we would get some different answers if we conducted the interviews today, not only because of Corona, but also because many of the crisis tendencies that were not that strong, or at least which were not that strongly conceived last year, now can be conceived much stronger. Yeah? And therefore, today, there would be possibly a better situation to also reason about issues like working time reduction, which is a very important issue. Yeah? We have to think, and I think the current crisis points into that direction. We have to think about the phase out of the car industry in the current form. And of course, we cannot simply reach this via conversion. That means that people produce products for other sectors, for example, public transport or bicycles or whatever, or respirators. Yeah? But we also have to think about working time reduction that indeed helps to manage this phase out in a way that it is socially just.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Francois has a question that goes kind of into that direction and links it with the degrowth movement. So I will take that question up next. We have the chance with COVID to transform completely the hypermobility pattern we're stuck in. Shouldn't we focus on offering jobs elsewhere? I think the degrowth movement has been very weak, staying on the defensive posture when workers accepted the car production stopped some time. Why not to convert production? Why did we accept social distancing and in the same time we did not pressure so that gas stations and highways shut down? Yes, I don't know. Whoever wants to answer.
I can start because, I mean, obviously, yeah, yes, but at the same time, who is we? I mean, the thing is, I can't offer anyone a job, so that's why we did this project in the first place. So to have a better understanding of what are perspectives of the workers themselves. And this is, obviously this sometimes is difficult because these people don't say what we would like them to say, or these kind of things, but nevertheless, I think it is important. And yes, definitely, I think that the Corona crisis offer some chances, but at the same time, I'm really not sure on how and who should do this. I know who I think should do it. But from where we are at the moment, I think it's very difficult to still to move in another direction, as we all, probably all of the people that take part in the conference, don't offer jobs to people, especially not in the automotive industry. So there has to be socially negotiated form of alternative, so either alternative income provision, that people and workers are not so dependent on the sectors that they work in, which would be good, but which, yeah, I don't see in Austria, also not not in the course of the Corona crisis. And on the other hand, there has to be a transformation of the production itself, so that people can produce other products, which is equally difficult. But I think that's where the project tried to give at least some hints, and also tried in a transdisciplinary way together with the workers, elaborate on what might be conditions to do so. And I think, so we haven't presented this in detail now, but Markus mentioned it briefly. So this focus on an alternative form of industrial policy, I think would be key also on the European level. And at the moment, I think the Corona crisis indeed might accelerate certain policies, so that there has to be a kind of coordinated move to transform a highly interdependent industrial production to something else. And then obviously, I mean, in the EU, also the Green Deal and whatever is proposed, this won't be enough. We all know this, because it is not really about reducing competition, but it's actually about being able to compete with China, with other emerging powers. But nevertheless, it might be an entry point to think about industrial policies in a different way, and in a way that is different from the neoliberal vision that was so dominant in the last decades.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'm going to throw in Dennis' second question here, even though he's male and it's his second question. Markus, maybe you can get ready for an answer. The contradiction between workers' environmental consciousness and their unquestioning stance on their work seems to attest to the fundamentally undemocratic and alienating character of capitalist wage labor. Itself no new finding. But under conditions of the climate crisis, this seems to provide a powerful argument for economic democratization, doesn't it? And Markus, you also concluded with economic democratization in your presentation. Maybe you can also take COVID into account in your answer. what are the possibilities right now? What would be a strategic choice to reach economic democratization?
Mm. Yeah, I think this is a very crucial thing, and we concluded with this. And with I think the absence of economic democracy and the fact that work takes place under capitalist property relations is a major reason for the fact that the workers' knowledge towards more sustainable and socially useful forms of production cannot be activated. This is what we found out. It's also interesting in the interviews. So sometimes the people say, I know it is pretentious to say that we steer the company. I know that it's pretentious that we know in which direction it could go. So they see that they have the knowledge and they could indeed transform the production towards a socially and environmentally more useful form, but they cannot because they are forced to go on by the existing property relations. And at the same time, they confirm or affirm these property relations because they say it is pretentious. Why it is pretentious? It's not pretentious. They are the ones who control the production. So, and from that, one could indeed conclude that economic democracy is necessary, not as an objective as such. It is also a purpose in itself. Because democratic decision making can be considered a purpose in itself. Everybody shall have the chance to equally participate in the making of those decisions of which consequences he or she is affected. And it is also a means towards an environmentally and socially useful production. I think this is an argument that one can indeed conclude from our research. As COVID-19 is concerned, I think here we can, let's say, the COVID-19 experience is an experience that underlines the, if you want, so systemically relevant forms of production. In the crisis of 2008-2009, the banks were considered systemically relevant. Today, nobody says the banks are systemically relevant. Systemically relevant are workers in the health sector, in the agriculture and food sector, at the checkouts of the supermarkets, and so on. I think the social useful production is emphasized by COVID-19. This could be a redirection. How can we strengthen this? How can we strengthen the socially useful production? How can we restart the economy in a way that we do not simply go back to business as usual, but that we restart the economy starting, or let's say, and combine this restarting with a reimagination of the economy and reimagination of the economy from the perspective of socially useful work, care, infrastructure provision, and so on. That is what the foundational economy collective has called the economy of the everyday life, or the foundational economy, so the basic life-supporting systems on which we all depend, and which indeed have proved crucial in this crisis. And this is also a question of economic democracy, because we can only do so if we do not leave certain basic services and the production of goods to the market, but if we democratically control it. If we don't do that, then of course we will go back to a business as usual quite quickly. We have to think about this. So here we see a very strong connection, I think, between the workers' consciousness and its systematic restriction by capitalist property relations on the one hand, socially useful products on the other hand, and economic democracy as a means to liberate workers' consciousness and workers' knowledge out of these systematic restrictions and to foster socially and environmentally useful production.
Melanie, do you want to add something? Okay, then that already kind of was in Markus' answer, but still I want to read the question from M out loud. From an ecological, climate justice, degrowth perspective, a radical reduction of car production is needed over the next few years. From what I take from your interviews, this process will rather lead to an acceleration of the conflict between workers in the automobile industry and the climate justice movement. Do you agree with that, or do you see any possible ways out of that dilemma? And as we only have 5 minutes left, I would maybe ask you to also do your concluding remarks when you answer that question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's an important question, and I think that this does not necessarily be the case. And from what for example, in the course of the Corona crisis and the proposals against the bailout of automotive industries, for example, some of the environmental justice movements have, I think, very smartly put the agenda forward in saying we stand together with the workers who need alternatives against the industry and the state who won't take the climate crisis seriously. Because I think this also relates to one of the questions I've read in the chat. So who's going to pay for this? Working time reduction is very costly. The management will say, well, we can't afford this. Obviously, I mean, such a transformation won't just happen. Somebody has to build up conditions for it. Somebody has to pay for it. I think that's quite obviously. But it doesn't need to be the workers. And if the movements manage to direct to kind of create the state or the managers as the opponents, so to say, I think that could work. I mean, then I think it's not easy because, as we, for example, in a neighboring sector in the aviation sector in Austria see right now, it's really difficult to fight for a phase out also together with the workers, because the workers obviously know there are just no alternatives at the moment. And that's a problem, because you know that there is no alternative to the job that you have, then you're gonna fight for this job no matter how shit you are paid. So I think that's a real problem, but I think that's where the fight has to be. So if you take, because there is a very broad consensus on the climate crisis. So in the public, there is still a very broad consensus, and this has to be directed towards those that are in power, because they're the ones that take the decisions have to decide otherwise, or, and this is more important, other people have to take the decisions. And so I think, yeah, this could be some of the conflict lines where the degrowth movement and the environmental justice movement could focus on. So we need to change the decision making power, and those that are in power now, they have to do something. They have to pay for it. They are the ones that are the opponents, and not the workers necessarily.
Yeah, I would negate the jobs versus environment dilemma, but I think there is a possibility to overcome it. Yeah, it's not easy, but it's not necessary that the conflict between the environmental movement on the one hand and the workers on the other hand will enhance. There could also be a common coalition, common struggling. I think workers, they want decent jobs, they want meaningful work, and this is very legitimate. But I think capitalism does not offer them decent jobs anymore, because they are permanently under pressure, under stress, and permanent reorganization, and capitalism doesn't offer them the possibility to do meaningful work, because capitalism forces them to use their competences and their knowledge for environmentally and socially destructive products. And here, the environmental movement and the workers come together. They can think about how we can, or the workers can think about how we can use our competences, how we can use our knowledge for producing products, for doing services that are in line with the protection of the environment. This is very important. Here, this comes together. But this requires, of course, that what we have talked about before, that requires questioning capitalist property relations, and that requires thinking about and struggling for environmental and economic democracy.
Thank you, Markus and Melanie, and thank you everyone for your interesting questions. Verena has already posted the link to the Discord forum, so you can just click there and the discussion can continue. I wish everyone a great last day of the Degrowth conference. It was good to have you here. Bye.
Thank you, Nora.
Thank you.